Wyoming, January 1893. The kind of winter that doesn't arrive. It invades. Snow swallows the valley whole, fence lines, roads, everything familiar, until the world is nothing but white and wind and the sound of something being erased. Somewhere on Greystone Ridge, a thread of smoke rises from the hillside. Not from a cabin, not from a chimney, from the ground itself. Pull closer, through the pines, down the limestone slope, to a door buried under 4 feet of snow, heavy timber iron hinges, carved initials no one living has ever seen. Inside that door, enough food to survive an entire winter. A stove still warm, a journal written by a dead man's hand, and papers that could destroy everything one man spent years carefully building. A boy stands at the threshold holding a lantern. His dog is already inside. He hasn't opened the tin yet. Part 1. The Locked Door. The snow came down sideways that night, driving, horizontal, the kind of storm that didn't fall so much as arrive, a full commitment from the sky. No warning, no negotiation. It hit Greystone Ridge first the way it always did, piling against the limestone face before spreading down into the valley below, like something that had been waiting for permission and finally got it. Caden Merritt stood on the front porch of his own house, his boots soaked through already, his breath turning white and dissolving in the dark. His hands stuffed deep into coat pockets that were good wool but not good enough for this. 16 years old, standing outside a locked door. He hadn't heard the bolt slide. That was the part that stayed with him later, not the fact of being locked out, but the silence of it. He'd walked out to check on the woodpile 3 minutes at the outside, and when he came back, the latch was thrown. No raised voices, no warning, just a door that had been open for the entire length of his life now closed against him like it had never been otherwise. He stood there looking at it, Sonny pressed against his leg. The dog was heavy and solid warm in a way that felt almost unfair given the cold working steadily through Caden's coat. Sonny didn't whine, didn't bark, just leaned the full deliberate weight of a dog who understood that some moments didn't call for noise. Caden looked through the window. The fire was going inside, orange and steady the way his mother had always kept it, banked well, not wasteful, burning clean. His father's chair sat near the hearth, the big one with the cracked armrest that Thomas Merritt had always said he'd get around to fixing. That chair. Douglas Fenn was sitting in it now, paper spread across the table beside him, a glass of something amber catching the firelight. His feet planted on the floor like he'd owned the room for decades, like the chair had always been his. Caden watched him for a long moment, long enough to notice that Douglas didn't look toward the window, didn't check to see if the boy had come back yet. Whatever Douglas Fenn was feeling in that room, the absence of Caden Merritt was not a discomfort he appeared to be managing. Caden looked west. Sonny had already turned that direction. The dog's nose was up, ears forward, something in his posture that was less about alertness and more about certainty. Like he'd already decided something and was waiting for the person on the rope to catch up. Caden didn't follow. Not yet. He stood on that porch long enough for the cold to move past his coat and settle into his ribs, long enough to understand that nobody inside was coming to open the door. Long enough to make sure he understood it completely, because a boy he knew, but a boy who needed to start thinking like a man, shouldn't act on incomplete understanding. Then he stepped off the porch into the dark. His father's name was Thomas Merritt. He died in January 5 winters back in a logging accident on the North Ridge. The kind that happened fast, which people mentioned afterward, as though speed constituted a mercy, as though the quickness of a thing neutralized its permanence. Caden had been 11. Old enough to read the faces of the men who came to the door with their hats off, old enough to understand what that particular posture meant. Young enough that he'd still believe for perhaps an hour after that someone would come back and tell him a mistake had been made. No one did. His mother, Clara, was not a fragile woman. She'd worked the farm beside Thomas from the beginning, knew how to read weather and stretch a winter larder and fix a fence post in frozen ground. She grieved Thomas the way strong people grieve privately and then relentlessly forward. Caden had learned more from watching her in those first 2 years than he'd learned from almost anything else. Then she'd met Douglas Fenn. 2 years after Thomas died, a church social in Dunwell Creek. Douglas was well-dressed, polished, the kind of man who moved through rooms without friction, charming to the right people, invisible to the ones who didn't matter to him. He ran a dry goods operation. Respectable enough. His hands were soft and his boots were good, and he knew everyone worth knowing in 4 counties. Clara said he was steady. Caden, who was 13, said nothing, because 13-year-olds weren't asked. Probably more than people thought he knew, but he was 13. Douglas moved in 6 months after the wedding, and he moved in the way water entered a structure, quietly finding every low point filling space that hadn't been offered. He rearranged small things first, where the tools hung, which shelf held which jar. The axe went from the north peg to the east peg. The seed catalogs moved from the kitchen shelf to the parlor. Each change small enough that objecting to it would have seemed strange. But the changes accumulated, and after a while, Caden walked through the house he'd grown up in and couldn't find a single thing where his father had left it. He didn't say anything about that, because his mother was happy, or something adjacent to it, something that wore the shape of happiness from the outside, and he told himself that was sufficient. He told himself he'd adapt. He told himself it was enough that she was smiling again. Then last autumn came. His mother started coughing in October, dry at first, following a cold that had gone around the valley. The kitchen fireplace worked fine. The parlor stove was decent, but the bedroom, hers and Douglas's now, had a broken chimney flue. Had been broken since September, when a piece of the liner had cracked and the draft went sideways. Caden had noticed it when he was cleaning the gutters and seen the smoke coming wrong. She mentioned it to Douglas. He said he'd see to it. November arrived. The flue remained unaddressed. She asked again. Douglas said the ground was too frozen for the work now. Parts couldn't be sourced until spring. These things took time. She'd be fine with extra blankets. She was not fine. The cough deepened through November, settled into her chest, pulled something loose with every iteration that it couldn't seem to put back. She started waking in the nights. Caden lay in the dark, listening through the wall, that particular inhale, the pause, the long, wet cough, and he counted seconds between them, telling himself that if the intervals widened, she was improving. They narrowed instead. The doctor came in December, twice. Pneumonia, he said. She needed consistent warmth in that room. He said it plainly and directly to Douglas, while Caden stood in the doorway, and Douglas nodded with the expression of a man who found agreement easier than listening. Of course. Absolutely. He'd take care of it. He did not take care of it. Clara Merritt died on the 4th of January, 1893. The room she died in was 41 degrees. Caden checked the thermometer afterward, just stood in the doorway looking at the number. 41 degrees, the same as a cold root cellar, the same as a stone floor in November. The woodpile had been fully stocked all winter. He'd stacked it himself, 4 cords behind the house, split and covered. The woodpile was never the problem. The problem was a flue that needed $40 of parts and 2 days of work, and Douglas Fenn had decided $40 was poorly timed. 3 days after the funeral, Caden found the notebook. He hadn't been looking for it. He was going through his mother's sewing box for the brass thimble, the one she'd worn on her right hand, for as long as he could remember, the one that had belonged to her own mother before that. He wanted it, not for any practical reason, just to have it somewhere he could see it. The sewing box was on the back shelf of the wardrobe. He pulled it out and found the notebook wedged behind it, soft leather cover, small enough to fold into a coat pocket, tied shut with cord. He almost didn't open it. He did. Her handwriting was careful, always had been. Clara Merritt had written the way she did, everything with full attention, like the act of putting words on paper was a commitment she took seriously. The entries went back to August, when Douglas had first explained that the cattle sales would cover the farm debts, but the margins were tight. She'd recorded the numbers, dates and amounts precise and clear. October 12th, asked Dee again about the bedroom flue. He says spring. October 28th. Cough is worse. Woke 3 times. Dee says wear more to bed. That is not the problem, and he knows it. November 14th. Told him I was frightened. He patted my hand and said I was being dramatic. I am not being dramatic. I am being cold. December 1st, the doctor says I need heat in that room. Dee nodded like he understood. I watched his face while he nodded. I don't believe he understood. Or perhaps he understood perfectly. December 19th. I asked him directly this time. Said, Douglas, the room is making me sicker. I need this fixed. He said he'd look into it. He will look into it the way a man looks through a window, from the outside, without going in. December 28th. I am frightened for Caden. Not for myself, for him. Dee has never looked at this boy the way a man looks at a son. I should have seen that sooner. I am sorry I did not see it sooner. Caden read it twice. The second time slowly all the way through because he believed that things worth reading were worth reading until they were fully understood. Then he folded the notebook and tucked it inside the inner lining of his coat against his skin where it would stay warm and dry. He stood for a moment in the cold room, 41 degrees still. The thermometer hadn't moved, and looked at the broken flue cover, black and useless, on the wall above the sealed fireplace. He did not cry. He went downstairs and washed his hands and did the evening chores because the animals needed feeding regardless of everything else, and because work had always been the thing that kept him from being swallowed by whatever he was feeling. That was 3 days before Douglas put the cloth bag on the kitchen table. The morning it happened had no particular weather to frame it. Gray sky, moderate wind fields, frozen flat and colorless. They sat at the table. Douglas had coffee and had not offered Caden any, which was the kind of small signal that Caden had learned to read without comment. The bag wasn't large. Inside, half a loaf of hard bread, a package of salt pork, one wool blanket, the older one with the patch on the lower corner. Caden recognized that patch immediately. His mother had sewn it 2 winters back, sitting by the kitchen lamp, her hands moving with the particular economy of someone who found satisfaction in a task done precisely. He looked at the bag. He looked at Douglas. Douglas set 2 sheets of paper on the table. The farm deed with his mother's name. The bill of sale for the eastern pasture arranged with a buyer in Casper before Clara had been in the ground a week. "Your name isn't on anything," Douglas said. The tone of it was what Caden would remember, not cruel, not apologetic, not even particularly uncomfortable. The tone of a man stating a temperature reading. Just information. Just how things stood. "The farm belonged to your mother. It passes to her husband. That's the law of the territory." Caden looked at the papers. His father had worked this land for 11 years. His grandfather before that. The fence posts along the south field were Thomas Merritt's fence posts, driven by Thomas Merritt's hands in ground. Thomas Merritt had cleared. The drainage trench along the north pasture, Thomas had dug that by hand in the summer of 1884. Every board in the livestock shed, every stone in the well surround every corner post on the property. None of that showed up in the deed. None of it weighed anything in law. "You can stay through the week," Douglas said, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "Give you time to make arrangements." Caden looked at the cloth bag, at the blanket, at the patch his mother's hands had put there. "That's it," he said. His voice came out quieter than he'd intended, controlled, not small. The way you spoke when you understood that volume was not the tool you needed. Something shifted in Douglas's face, brief, small. The flicker of a man who found the moment mildly inconvenient. "It's a fair provision, better than the situation strictly requires." Caden nodded once. He stood up. He went upstairs and packed the canvas rucksack his father had used on hunting trips. Clothes. The folding knife Thomas had given him on his 14th birthday. The notebook carefully wrapped. A coil of good rope bought with his own wages from fence work last summer. A box of matches. The brass thimble which he'd found in the sewing box the same day as the notebook. That went into the breast pocket of his coat close. He came back down. Douglas was still at the table. Not reading, not doing anything exactly. Just sitting in the chair that had been Thomas Merritt's with the coffee going cold and the papers sitting where he'd put them. Caden stopped at the kitchen doorway, looked at the man for a moment. He had the shape of something to say, could feel it sitting in his chest, large and hot, and accumulated over 2 years of small accommodations and held silences. But it had no particular words yet, or it had too many words at once, and none of them would come out in any order that would be useful. He said nothing. He walked out the front door. Sonny was on the porch. The dog stood the moment Caden appeared, not startled, just ready the way the dog always was when Caden came to him with a purpose. Tail moving slowly. That specific attention. Caden hadn't called him, hadn't whistled. The dog simply knew. He clipped the rope to Sonny's collar out of habit, an automatic gesture, and stepped off the porch into the cold. Behind him, after a moment, he heard the bolt slide home. He didn't look back. Dunwell Creek was 14 miles south. In reasonable weather, with a horse and decent footing, a man could make it well before dark. On foot in January, in conditions that were already difficult and getting worse by the quarter hour, that calculation changed considerably. The first mile was hard. The second was concerning in a way that had no clean words for it. By the third, Caden understood that what he'd entered wasn't winter in the usual sense. The storm had come from the northwest, which meant it hit the ridge first and then descended into the valley with all the accumulated force of unbroken travel. The road had begun to disappear, not covered erased. Snow came horizontal and dense, filling wagon ruts and landmarks he'd walked past so many times he could usually navigate them half asleep. He kept his head down and counted steps and stayed on the west side of the fence line where he could still find it. His boots were good, his coat was good. His grandfather Reuben had been categorical about that. Never cut corners on boots or coats, boy. Your feet and your warmth. Everything else in this world can be improvised. Reuben Merritt. Gone 3 years dying the way men who'd worked hard all their lives often did in his sleep, at an age that qualified as reasonable without fuss. Caden had spent time with him in the last months just sitting and listening while the old man talked about the land and the ridge and winters he'd survived by paying attention to things other people walked past. Reuben had a way of making preparation sound like the most natural human impulse and improvisation sound like an expensive mistake. The old man had said once something that Caden had halfway missed at the time: the land will take care of you if you know how to listen to it. But you've got to listen, boy. Not think. Listen. Caden had been 13. He thought he understood. He was beginning to understand more precisely what that meant. By mile 4, 2 toes on his left foot had gone quiet, not painful, just absent, which was in some ways more alarming than pain. He slowed, deliberately and consciously, because slowing was counterintuitive, and the instinct was to move faster to generate more warmth through movement. But his grandfather had explained that too. Panic burned fuel. Cold didn't care how much fuel you burned, it kept pulling the same amount regardless. The math favored calm. Sonny moved beside him, matching pace, his coat gathering snow along the spine and shedding it when he shook over and over with the patient repetition of a creature for whom discomfort was simply a condition to be managed. The dog had been pulling west since mile 2. Not frantically, nothing dramatic about it, just a steady, insistent pressure on the rope, like a compass needle being dragged off true and wanting to return. Each time Caden corrected south toward the road, the dog came back to that westward lean. Persistent. Certain. Caden had been correcting him. By mile 5, the road was gone completely. The fence line, too, either buried or he drifted past it in the white. He stopped moving, stood very still, and let his eyes work across the landscape slowly the way his father had taught him. When you're turned around in timber, stop. The worst thing a man can do when he's lost is keep moving confidently in the wrong direction. South, nothing but white. Undifferentiated distance erasing white. The road could be 50 yards ahead or buried completely under 3 feet of drift. No way to know from here. West, where Sonny was pulling the ridge. He could see it only as a dark mass against the white, the limestone face of Greystone Ridge, old and solid, running north to south along the valley's back edge. He'd walked that ridge with his grandfather 100 times. Knew every outcrop, every hollow, every place where the rock made a natural shelter or the pines broke the wind. He looked carefully at the air near the ridge. The storm hit the open valley floor clean and unbroken, sweeping horizontal for miles. But near the ridge, near the tree line, the gusts fractured and lost their direction. The pines interrupted the flow. The rock face redirected it. In the shadow of the ridge, the snow fell more vertically, less violently. A man caught out there could survive cold far longer than he could survive cold wind. His grandfather had been clear on that distinction too. Cold is just temperature. Wind is cold with deliberate purpose. Caden stood in the blizzard and ran the accounting one more time. On one side a road, he couldn't find a town 14 miles away. 2 numb toes, no shelter visible in any direction. On the other side, a dog who had been trying to show him something for 3 miles. A dog who had never in 4 years pointed at a thing that wasn't there. He looked down at Sonny. Sonny looked up. No performance in it. Just patience. Just waiting for the person on the rope to finish the reasoning that the dog had already completed. Caden exhaled a long white breath and felt it scatter sideways in the wind. "All right," he said. "Show me." He unclipped the rope. Sonny moved immediately, not running, not frantic, but direct. Purposeful in the way working animals moved when they'd been held back from something and were finally released to it. Clean through the drifts, low-slung and efficient, pausing every 20 yards or so to look back and confirm Caden was still coming. He was coming. Climbing the ridge was harder than it looked from below. The snow concealed loose rock under every step. His legs started going heavy in that specific winter way, not sore, not cramping, but weighted, as if the cold had quietly replaced the bones with something denser, while he wasn't watching. His thoughts started arriving with a half-second delay. That was the thing that alarmed him. Not the toes, not the heavy legs, but the slight lag in his own thinking, the sense of something thick between intention and execution. He knew what that meant. His grandfather had lost a friend to it. 1878, before Caden was born. A man who sat down in a snowbank to rest for 5 minutes and was found the next morning exactly as he'd left himself, still as stone, emptied of everything essential. Reuben had never sat down in the snow again after that, had walked past shelter sometimes when he was cold, had kept moving through discomfort rather than risk the particular comfort that preceded dying in winter. Ahead on the slope stood a bent pine, the trunk angled hard by years of ridge wind, the branches sweeping down to form a shallow, natural pocket on the leeward side. He could see from 20 feet away that the snow moved differently in there, more vertical, quieter. Maybe 5 minutes of relative shelter enough to let the feeling come back to those toes. He slowed. Sonny came back like a shot. The dog didn't bark. He bit, got his teeth into the sleeve of Caden's coat and pulled backward with a controlled force that Caden had never felt from him. Not anger. Something that would look like anger from the outside, but had a different quality up close. The quality of someone applying exactly as much force as the situation required, and not 1 unit more. The way experienced hands applied pressure to a wound. Caden nearly went down. He caught himself, looked at Sonny. The dog released the sleeve and moved to stand between Caden and the pine blocking. Deliberate as a wall. Caden understood. Men who sat down in storms like this often didn't stand back up. He closed his eyes for one count. Just one. Forced air into lungs that ached from the cold. Then opened his eyes, looked at Sonny, and pushed himself forward up the slope. "Okay," he said to himself as much as the dog. "Okay." The dog found it before Caden could see it. Sonny disappeared around a limestone shelf, and the barking started specific, layered with a pattern to it that Caden recognized as different from every other bark in the dog's repertoire. 3 sharp sounds, a pause, 3 more. Not alert barking, not fear barking. The bark of a dog calling someone to a specific location, repeated with the patience of an animal that understood repetition was sometimes required. Caden pushed around the limestone shelf and found Sonny already digging. Front paws driving hard into packed snow, throwing it back between his hind legs and solid blocks. Nose pressed into the trench he was making. The focused, certain energy of a dog who knew exactly what he was looking for and had found it. Caden dropped beside him. Helped. His hands were barely responding below the second knuckle. The fingers moved, barely carrying instructions from somewhere distant that arrived with a delay. He scooped and pushed and cleared. The snow here was dense and old, settled and crusted by time. His palm hit something that was not stone. He cleared more carefully around it. Wood. Cut wood, not a fallen branch. He could feel the edge. The precise straight line that nature didn't make in mountain stone. He worked outward, both hands scraping snow away from an expanding flat surface. A door emerged. Heavy timber. Iron strap hinges dark with age. 2 bolts, both drawn back the way you left a door when you went out, expecting to return and didn't. The wood was cold, but not as cold as the surrounding rock. Something had kept it fractionally warmer. The timber itself or the air sealed beneath it. He pressed his face close to the seam at the bottom of the door. A movement of air, low and steady and rising slightly the way breath rose. Not the wind was horizontal and violent. This came from underneath, from within. The hill was exhaling. He grabbed the iron handle with both hands and pulled. Nothing at first, then a sound from deep in the hinges, structural. The groan of something that hadn't moved in years being asked to move. He shifted his grip, put his body into it, felt the resistance peak, and then give the door swinging outward several inches. Air moved past his face. Dry air. Still air. Without wind. He hadn't understood until that precise moment how much of the killing cold was the wind and not the temperature itself. Standing in the draft from that underground opening, he felt the difference. The way you felt solid ground after bad footing as a physical relief, almost shocking. He shoved the door wider. Sonny went in first. Caden followed, pulling the door shut behind them. The storm vanished. Not gradually, almost completely in the space of a breath. He could still hear it the way you heard distant water inside a stone building, but the direct assault of it was gone. The horizontal ice, the pressure, the sound that had been pressing against every surface of him for the past hour. Gone. He stood still in the dark for a moment, Just listen to the quiet. Then he got out the matches. His hands shook badly. The first match tore on the striker. He made himself slow down, made his fingers do the work carefully, and the second match caught. Small orange flame. Just enough light to show him stone steps descending cedar support beams on both sides packed earth walls. Dry. No moisture on them despite the storm running hard outside. Sonny was already below, no hesitation, ears forward, and relaxed, interested rather than alarmed. Caden followed him down. The tunnel widened into a chamber. He held the match up and turned slowly. He would try later to find the right words for what he was looking at. He'd get close sometimes, and then the words would slide away from the thing they were trying to describe. Not because it was too large or too strange, because the right word was too simple. Too quiet for the occasion. Safe, he was looking at safe. Shelves covered every wall from floor to ceiling, heavy wooden shelves, hand-built, reinforced at the joints with iron brackets. Every shelf held food, glass jars sealed with waxed beans and carrots and pickled beets. Salt pork hanging from iron hooks set into the ceiling beams. 4 barrels sealed with waxed cloth. Potatoes packed in ash in the manner Caden recognized from his grandfather's root cellar, the ash drawing moisture and slowing freeze. Dried apples bundled near the upper beams. Sacks of rye and navy beans, each one coated with something that resisted moisture. Nothing thrown there in haste. Everything placed with thought. Everything arranged to last. At the center of the chamber stood a cast iron stove, small and efficient, connected to a stovepipe that disappeared into the rock overhead. Behind it, a limestone wall, thick and pale gray, darkened near the base where stored heat had touched the stone repeatedly over years and left its mark. Beside the stove, cedar firewood stacked and covered with oil-treated canvas. Dry all the way through, he picked up a piece and felt it. The kind of dry that only came from consistent, deliberate effort. From someone who understood that moisture was patient and that protecting against it required the same patience in return. Sonny walked the perimeter once, nose working at the base of each shelf, then came back to the stove and lowered himself onto the packed earth floor with a long, slow exhale. Stopped, trembling. Caden listened to the dog's breathing, slow and even out. Then he knelt beside the stove. He built the fire carefully, checked the firebox first, old dry ash inside, good sign. Checked the stovepipe connection, looked upward toward where the exhaust disappeared. No visible collapse, no heavy frost. He fed kindling and slowly struck the match with steady hands this time and waited. The fire caught. Heat moved through the chamber in the honest, unhurried way of a well-made stove doing what it was built to do. Not dramatic, not overwhelming, just steady, spreading warmth in a contained space that had nowhere to let it go. Caden sat back. Then he saw it. He'd been focused on the stove and the shelves and the food, the overwhelming practicality of the space, the evidence of intention in every corner. He hadn't looked carefully at the inside face of the door. He lit a fresh match and held it up. There, on the inside face of the heavy timber, carved deeper than the letters he'd seen on the outside, as if the person making them had intended this message for whoever would be standing inside, not passing by RM. And below, in slightly smaller but equally deliberate cuts, built to last, built to share. Reuben Merritt, his grandfather's initials. Caden sat down on the packed earth floor. His grandfather had built this place, had built it and never said a word about it, not in all the months Caden had spent sitting with him in the last year of his life. Not one word about a shelter under the ridge, about a room full of food, about a door with his initials on it. Sonny lifted his head and looked at him, then lowered it back to his paws. The fire ticked and settled. Outside, the storm continued. 2 feet of earth and stone away from where Caden sat, the blizzard was burying the road to Dunwell Creek and stripping heat from every surface it touched. It had no awareness of the chamber beneath the hill. It wasn't capable of awareness. Storms were honest that way, no spite, no preference, no awareness of what survived them and what didn't. They just were. But down here, the earth was keeping something. His grandfather's hands had built the shelves. His grandfather's hands had fitted the iron brackets and hung the hooks and placed the potatoes in the ash and stacked the cedar under oil canvas. All of it done and then kept secret for reasons Caden didn't know yet. And his grandfather was gone, and his father was gone, and his mother was gone, and he was 16 years old with a canvas rucksack and a folding knife and a notebook pressed against his skin. that told the truth about things most people would have preferred remained unwritten. He pressed his hand flat against the limestone wall behind the stove, felt the warmth in it, stored warmth. The warmth of fires built repeatedly over years absorbed slowly into stone that held it long after the wood was ash and the ashes were cold. Built to last, built to share. He let the match burn down to his fingers, sat in the dim orange glow from the stove grate for a long moment, not moving, just breathing. Then he stood up, took his boots off, set them near the stove and watched steam begin to rise from the leather. Opened one of the sealed jars, navy beans, and found a tin cup on a shelf near the stove that someone had left ready like a set table. While the beans warmed, he moved a lit match slowly along the walls and read the room the way his grandfather had taught him to read any space, not for what it contained, but for how it was thinking. The drainage trench along the lower wall, the secondary ventilation shaft near the ceiling, smaller than the main, but positioned to keep air moving through the deeper section. The slight forward tilt of the shelves so moisture would run off the edges. Every choice made by someone who had thought carefully about the problem, who had made mistakes first and then corrected them over winters with patience. His grandfather, Reuben Merritt, who had died 3 years ago without complaint and who had never once told Caden this place existed. The question of why sat with him while the fire steadied and Sonny's breathing deepened into sleep. Why build it and stay silent about it? Why the secrecy? The answer arrived in the same patient way cold arrived slow, certain not interested in being rushed. Because if nobody knew about it, nobody could take it. He sat with that for a while. Then he put the cup down, lay back on the packed earth floor with his coat folded under his head, and let the warmth of the fire and the warmth stored in the stone do the rest. The notebook was still against his chest. There might be nothing else here to find. Or there might be. But that was work for the morning. Tonight was for breathing, for being still and warm and alive. Tonight was enough. Part 2, what the ground remembers. He found the journal on the second morning, not through any plan. He was moving along the back wall doing what his grandfather had always insisted was the first task in any new situation inventory. Don't guess at what you have. No. Third shelf from the bottom. Behind a section of oilcloth, stiff with age and cold, he'd assumed it was covering another set of supplies. He pulled it aside, expecting jars or a tin. What he found was a book, small, smaller than a Bible. Leather-covered, dark brown, cracked along the spine from years of regular use. Tied shut with waxed cord. He held it without opening it for a moment. Sonny lifted his head from the floor. Watched. Caden untied the cord. The handwriting was his grandfather's. He knew it before he'd read a word the way each letter was formed with full intention, no shortcuts, no flourish. Reuben Merritt had written the way he'd done everything deliberately, as if he understood that things worth recording were worth recording clearly. The first entry, November 1879. First winter below. Stove draws well. Lost 1 sack of rye to moisture at the south wall, moved the remaining 3 to limestone blocks. Will not make that mistake again. Caden sat down on the packed earth floor and started reading. It took him most of the morning. Not because the journal was long, but because he read slowly, pausing every few pages to sit with what he'd absorbed. Reuben hadn't built the shelter in a single season. He'd started in autumn of 1879, finished the main chamber before the first snow, and spent the next 4 winters improving it. The drainage trench winter of 1880, after a wet spring, showed him where water wanted to go. The secondary ventilation winter of 1881, after he'd nearly poisoned himself with trapped smoke on a still night. The limestone block supports for the barrels 1882, after discovering that ground dampness traveled upward faster than he'd expected. Every improvement came from a mistake. Every mistake was recorded honestly without self-pity. He wrote about temperature curves and food preservation and the specific behavior of different wind directions on the stove draft. He wrote about cedar versus pine and why cedar was worth the extra effort even when pine was more readily available. He wrote in November 1882, "A man can fight winter directly, or he can stop fighting and start thinking. I spent 40 years fighting. Walls higher, fires, bigger, more cloth and more gaps. But the storm always has more time. It can wait. I cannot. The question is not how to fight it, but how to stop giving it so many targets." Caden read that paragraph twice, then kept going. The tone shifted in the middle sections. Still practical, still dates and temperatures and draft corrections. But something had come open in the writing that hadn't been there at the beginning. The voice of a man who'd started by recording information and found himself over years recording understanding. January 1883. Theodore came looking for shelter. Stovepipe collapsed on his cabin. I brought him below. He stayed 4 days. He couldn't believe the temperature down here. I told him it wasn't warmth exactly, it was stability. He said it felt the same. I said it wasn't, but I didn't push it. He'd understand the difference himself eventually. March 1884. 2 families sheltered here during the March blow. 7 people. The food held and the air held. Only trouble was the stovepipe draft. Too many bodies raises the interior temperature faster than expected, which changes the pressure differential and affects the draw. Widen the intake shaft 2 inches. Problem corrected. And then near the end of the journal, a different quality of entry. Shorter strokes. The pencil pressed harder. February 1886. Writing this because I need it written somewhere. Fenn made another offer for the western parcel last week. 3rd time. I declined as I have declined before. He is the kind of man who treats a refusal as a negotiating position rather than an answer. I have watched him at the county boundary meetings. I have watched how he listens not to understand but to locate. A man who listens to others only long enough to find the soft places is not a man you hand anything to. Not land, not trust. Caden stopped, read it again. Fenn. His grandfather had known Douglas Fenn, had known him for years, had watched him, had refused him 3 times and written down exactly why. He turned the page. April 1886. I have put the land papers in the tin, sealed it properly, goes in the floor cache behind the south shelf. My intention, if something happens before I can explain this properly, if Thomas dies before he can be told, if the land passes into hands that should not have it, whoever finds this place will find the truth of ownership and will have the means to prove it. I am not a suspicious man by nature. I am a careful one. Careful men plan for possibilities they hope never arrive. The fire ticked inside the stove, a small sound in a quiet room. Sonny had come to sit beside him at some point without Caden noticing the dog's weight warm and solid against his side. South shelf. He looked up at it. He found the tin an hour later. The floor cache was exactly where the journal described, behind the base of the south shelf, under a flat limestone capstone that looked like every other flat limestone piece in the floor, except that it was slightly more level, slightly more deliberately placed. He pried it up with the folding knife. The tin underneath was the size of a bread loaf, sealed with wax applied in multiple careful layers, a barrier built for permanence, not convenience. It had worked. When he pried the lid off, the interior was completely dry. Inside, 2 documents folded together in a separate sheet of paper in Reuben's hand. He read the separate sheet first. If you are Thomas, tell your son. If you are Caden, you are already old enough, or the world has already turned in ways I hoped it wouldn't. Either way, what is in these papers belongs to the Merritts. The western parcel from the ridge crest to the creek bend, 114 acres. It was never for sale. It will never be for sale. Not by me, not by Thomas, not by anyone who does not carry this name. Caden, if it is you, I am sorry I didn't tell you this in person. I kept meaning to. I thought there was more time than there was. There is always less time than you think. He set the sheet face down on the packed earth beside him. Then he unfolded the documents. He wasn't educated in law, but he could read and he could recognize structure. What he was looking at had the structure of something binding. A deed to the western parcel of Greystone Ridge, recorded with Harrow County in July 1881. Reuben Merritt's signature. Notarized. 2 witnesses named in careful script below the seal. And beneath it, a codicil to his grandfather's will, dated 3 months before the old man's death. Written in the same hand, witnessed by 2 men Caden didn't recognize, notarized by the same Dunwell Creek notary. The western parcel passes in full to my son Thomas James Merritt, and upon his death to his son Caden Thomas Merritt, and to no one else. Not Clara, not Clara's husband, not Douglas Fenn. Caden sat on the floor of his grandfather's hidden shelter in the middle of the worst blizzard in 40 years, holding a piece of paper that said the land Douglas Fenn had taken wasn't Douglas Fenn's to take. He thought about that for a long time, because here was what kept turning over in him. Douglas hadn't moved quickly. He'd been patient, precise, methodical. The marriage, perhaps there had been something genuine in it Caden couldn't know, and had decided he wasn't interested in deciding. But the farm, the eastern pasture, the cattle, the timber rights, all of it arranged so carefully. Every document in proper order, every signature obtained. From a widow who was grieving and trusting and had no reason to scrutinize the edges of what her new husband was claiming. But not this parcel, because this parcel was in a tin in a cache under a stone in a room that nobody knew existed. His grandfather had planned for exactly this. Not because he'd foreseen Douglas Fenn specifically, but because careful men planned for the shape of things, and the shape of what Douglas Fenn wanted had been visible to Reuben from the county boundary meetings of 1884. Caden put the documents back in the tin, replaced the lid without resealing the wax. Considered putting the tin in the rucksack, decided against it. The cache had protected these papers for 7 years. The cache would continue to protect them. He put it back, replaced the limestone capstone, and sat back on his heels, and heard the knock. 3 sounds, slow, spaced deliberately. Not the storm was continuous and violent and had no rhythm to it. This had rhythm. The specific rhythm of a human hand trying to be heard through heavy timber. Sonny was on his feet before Caden fully registered what he'd heard. He grabbed the lantern and climbed the stairs, stood at the door. "Hello," loud enough to carry through the wood. A pause, long enough for him to wonder if he'd imagined it. Then a voice, muffled by timber and storm. Female, older, not panicked, not screaming or frantic, just making herself heard, controlled and clear, the voice of someone who had made a decision and was seeing it through. "Someone in there. We saw smoke." He pulled the bolt and leaned into the door. The storm hit him, ice and wind and pressure all at once. He shoved the door wider and held it. 2 figures on the stone ledge outside. A woman. 60s, maybe older. Sturdy build, good coat, not warm enough for this specific weather, but clearly quality, well-maintained, the coat of someone who took care of her things. Snow banked on her shoulders and hat brim. Her face carrying the expression of a person who had made a hard choice and was committed to it regardless of how it felt. Beside her, sheltering behind her arm, a boy. 10 maybe. Dark coat scarf wound multiple times around the lower half of his face, eyes wide and serious above the wool. The woman looked at Caden. "You build this," she said. "My grandfather did." "Is there room?" He stepped aside without another word. She came in without asking twice. Her name was Winifred Holt. Win, she said immediately, not Winifred. That was for people she was irritated with. The boy was Jasper, her grandson, 10 years old, and once he'd unwound the scarf and absorbed the shock of the warmth, apparently in possession of continuous opinions about everything he encountered. "It smells like dirt," Jasper said. "It is dirt," Caden said. "Why is it warm if it's dirt?" Wynne turned and looked at her grandson with an expression that communicated without requiring any words that now was not the time, and he would do well to recognize that. Jasper sat down. Sonny crossed to him, immediately pressed his nose against Jasper's knee, and held it there. Jasper looked at the dog, then at Caden, then back at the dog. "Is he friendly?" "He's the reason we found this place," Caden said. Jasper put his hand on Sonny's head, cautious at first, then with the full, unreserved commitment that 10-year-olds brought to dogs once they decided approval was warranted. Wynne was not looking at the dog. She was looking at the room. Systematically, shelves to ceiling, to walls, to floor, and back again. The methodical survey of someone who had learned to assess situations before committing to responses. She moved through the information the way experienced people move through information, gathering, categorizing, drawing conclusions without announcing them. She'd done this kind of thing before. Not this specific situation, but this kind of situation, the inventory of a crisis, the rapid mapping of what was available and what it could do. "You're by yourself," she said. "Yes." "How long here?" 4 days. She looked at him then, not the room him. The assessment moved faster over a person than over a space, but it was just as complete. "How old are you, Matty?" "Who's 16? A beat of quiet. "And whose shelter is this?" "My grandfather built it. He died 3 years ago." "He told you about it?" "He didn't," Caden said. "Sonny found it." Wynne looked at the dog. Jasper was now using Sonny as a pillow, which Sonny had accepted without complaint, and seemed to be finding actively comfortable. She said. Then she took off her coat, draped it over a shelf edge to dry, pushed her sleeves up to the elbow despite the temperature and said, "What needs doing?" That was the moment, though, Caden couldn't have articulated it at the time, that the shelter became something different. Not a hiding place, a home. Winifred Holt had been a field nurse for 3 years in the early 1860s during a typhoid outbreak that moved through 4 Wyoming counties when she was in her 20s. She'd worked under a doctor named Pemberton who had believed and argued for against considerable resistance from men with more credentials and less experience, that the difference between patients who survived and patients who didn't was almost never the medicine. It was almost always the environment. Temperature, cleanliness, airflow, the quality of what they ate and drank. The unglamorous, unrecognized basics that nobody gave medals for managing well. She had never stopped thinking that way in the 40 years since. Within an hour of arriving, she had reorganized the sleeping area, assessed the food stores with the practiced eye of someone who'd rationed provisions under real pressure, before identified a section of ceiling beams showing early moisture accumulation, and pointed it out to Caden without comment, and determined that Jasper had a developing blister on his right heel from wet boots that needed wrapping immediately before it became a more serious problem. All of it without announcement, without making any of it about herself. Caden watched her and recognized something he'd seen before, but rarely the visible shape of competence the way it looked from outside when someone moved through a problem without wasted motion or performance. "You know about ventilation," she said at one point. A statement, not a question. "My grandfather taught me." "And condensation. He wrote about it." Caden showed her the relevant sections of the journal. She read with her lips pressed together, nodding occasionally, the small economical nod of someone confirming that what they're reading matches what they already know from experience. "He was right about the airflow," she said when she'd finished. "Trapped warmth is as dangerous as cold, just slower. Most people don't account for it." That's almost his exact phrasing. "Smart man." Yes, he was. She handed the journal back. He shelved it. Outside, the storm held. Inside, they found a rhythm. On the 5th night, more people came. First, a trapper named Aldous Cork. Lean, weathered 50-something, frost heavy on his beard, and one ear gone pale in a way that made Wynn take him by the arm and pull him toward the stove without ceremony. She examined the ear with the clinical attention of someone for whom frostbite had a treatment protocol. Early stage. She rewrapped it with cloth from her coat lining and told him not to touch it. He sat with warm water and said almost nothing, which appeared to be his baseline state. Then a family. Walter Greer, his wife May, 3 children between 4 and 9. Their storage shed had collapsed under snow weight. Flour corn, most of their dried goods gone. May Greer came through the door carrying the 4-year-old on her hip, and her face carried the expression of a woman who had burned through everything she had in 2 days of keeping her children alive, and had nothing left for anything except sitting down somewhere that wasn't trying to kill her. Caden helped her through the entrance. Wynn moved across the room before the woman had taken 2 steps inside, lifted the 4-year-old off her hip with the practiced ease of someone who had held many children in many difficult moments, settled the boy against her shoulder, and carried him toward the stove. May sat down, pressed both hands over her face, said nothing for a while. Wynn caught Caden's eye over the 4-year-old's head and gave him a single small nod. "I have this. You take care of the rest." He did. 2 people the shelter had held without strain. 7 pushed it into territory that required active management. Interior temperature rose faster with more bodies than the ventilation was calibrated for. Condensation began forming on the upper shelf sections. The food stores needed recalculating. The drainage trench along the rear wall had partially compacted inward and needed clearing. Caden worked through all of it systematically without announcing what he was doing or asking anyone to notice. He widened the lower intake shaft with the iron rod from the stovepipe wall. The air in the chamber changed within a few hours, cleaner the stuffiness that had been building since the Greers arrived, dissipating steadily. He reorganized the sleeping area to keep wet coats near the entrance tunnel rather than near the food stores because moisture moved toward warmth and warmth was centralized near the food. He rationed everything evenly. No adjustments for who had arrived with provisions and who had arrived empty-handed because that distinction was irrelevant underground. What mattered down here was that everyone ate enough to make good decisions and stay warm enough to sleep. Hunger produced bad decisions. Bad decisions in a place with one exit and limited air circulation were a collective problem. Walter Greer the second day pulled 2 hard biscuits from his coat pocket and tried to pass them to his children without the group seeing. Caden noticed, said nothing about the biscuits, But that evening, he made sure the Greer children's portions were full before he distributed the remainder. Walter looked at him. Caden looked back. Nothing more needed saying. Wynne understood it intuitively. So did Aldous, who had spent enough winters alone in the backcountry to know that generosity in extremity was not sentiment, it was the most practical available tool. The Greers understood it by the third day. Jasper, on the third morning, looked around at the organized underground space with all its inhabitants and said, "It's like a village, except underground. Except there's a dog." Wynne looked at Caden. Caden looked at Wynne. "He's not wrong," she said. "No," Caden agreed. On the seventh evening, with the storm still pressing hard outside, and 8 people breathing quietly around a small stove in an underground room, Caden went back to the journal. He'd been thinking since finding the tin about the entries that came before the section on Douglas Fenn. Reuben had written about the philosophical shift about moving from fighting winter to working with it. Caden found the page. December 1885. I have been thinking about why I built this underground. Why I didn't just build a better cabin. Thomas calls it eccentric. He's probably right. But the logic holds in a way I can't make people understand unless they've spent a winter watching everything above ground lose the fight 1 degree at a time. Underground, the hill absorbs change slowly. Cold moves through earth differently than through air. The hill doesn't surrender to a single cold night. It remembers heat from weeks ago and gives it back gradually. That's not warmth. That's something more valuable than warmth. That's stability. I am not smarter than winter. I stopped trying to be. And that's when things started working. Caden stood at the shelf reading that paragraph. He thought about his mother's notebook entry. December 28th. I am frightened for Caden. Not for myself. For him. He thought about his grandfather's letter from the tin. I am sorry I didn't tell you this in person. I kept meaning to. I thought there was more time. He thought about Douglas Fenn sitting in Thomas Merritt's chair, with his feet on the floor like he'd been there his whole life, setting down a cloth bag with a patch blanket in it and explaining without cruelty that Caden's name wasn't on anything. Here was what 16 felt like in that specific moment, in that underground room with a storm outside and 8 people sleeping around him who were alive because of a shelter and a journal and a dog and a series of decisions that had been made before he was born by a man who'd hoped he'd never need them. It felt like too much. And exactly the right amount. Because too much was still something. Weight meant you were still standing, still in the argument. He shelved the journal and went to check the ventilation shaft because the shaft needed checking, and there was always something that needed doing. The knock on the 8th night was different. Heavier, more deliberate. 3 beats a pause, then 2 more, almost a signal, the pattern of someone who'd thought about what knocking on an unknown door in a blizzard should communicate before they started knocking. Sonny was on his feet before Caden had fully registered the sound. He climbed the stairs. Wynne appeared at the base of them without being summoned the way she always appeared when something required assessment. Not hovering, just present. He opened the door. The woman on the step was in her 40s, broad-shouldered, solid, a badge on her coat half obscured by ice. Hat pulled low so her face was mostly shadow and jawline and white breath. 2 horses behind her on a lead rope, both with heads down and manes frozen solid. Caden Merritt, she said. His stomach dropped in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. She knew his name. How did she know his name? Who are you? He said. Sheriff Bet Calloway. Dunwell Creek. No particular inflection on it. Not aggressive, not apologetic. Just the fact. I've been looking for you. He gripped the doorframe. She saw it. Her weight shifted back slightly, small, deliberate, a movement that communicated clearly. I see what I'm triggering in you, and I'm not going to push against it. I'm not here because Douglas Fenn sent me, she said. He waited. Aldous Cork sent a message before the second blow came through. Said a boy had found shelter on the ridge. Said there were people alive up here. She looked past him into the entrance tunnel. I needed to verify that. Wynne's voice came from the base of the stairs. Let her in. Her horses need the leeward side of the hill. Caden looked back at Wynne. Wynne looked at him with the expression of a woman who had made an assessment in approximately 4 seconds and was waiting for him to catch up to it. He stepped aside. Bet Calloway was not what he'd prepared himself for. He'd braced for someone carrying Douglas Fenn's instructions, wearing authority, like a weapon paperwork ready in an inside pocket. Instead, she stood in the middle of the chamber and looked at it the way Wynne had looked at it on the first night, the same systematic attention, moving from shelves to stove to sleeping area to drainage trench and back. Then she looked at Caden with the longer kind of look, the kind that was revising its initial impression and willing to take time with the revision. "How many people?" she said. "8, including Jasper." "Who's Jasper?" From the sleeping area without opening his eyes, "Me." Wynne stepped forward and extended her hand. "Winifred Holt. I knew your predecessor, Sheriff." Bet took it. Something shifted in her expression, recognition arriving slowly. "Wynne Holt. You nursed half of Dunwell Creek through the fever in the 70s. And the other half the decade before that. You're on Copper Creek Road." "I am." "That road is under 4 feet of snow. Which is why I'm here," Wynne said with the patience of someone explaining an obvious thing to someone who should have already understood it. Bet looked at the space again, at the lamplit faces, at the organized, maintained functioning room, at Caden standing near the stovepipe with the iron rod in his hand. He'd been about to check the draft when the knock came. "Douglas Fenn," she said, flatly, not asking. Caden said nothing. "He came to my office 3 days ago," she said. "Asked me to look into the property situation on Greystone Ridge. Said someone might be making claims he considered unfounded." Her voice was perfectly level, carrying no more weight than the words themselves. The fire ticked. Somewhere in the sleeping area, the Greer 4-year-old made a small sound and went quiet again. Caden held Bet Calloway's gaze. She held his. "I need to know," she said, "what you found in this shelter." And that was the difference. Not "what are you doing here?" Not "what right do you have to this place?" What did you find? The framing of someone who had already decided there was something to find and was asking for the answer rather than the premise. She was treating him like his answer was worth hearing. He crossed to the south shelf, lifted the limestone capstone, removed the tin, set it on the shelf between them. "My grandfather built this shelter," he said. "He left papers here about the land." Bet looked at the tin, looked at him. "May I?" He pushed it toward her. She opened it with care, unfolded each document separately, and read it with the thorough, unhurried attention of someone for whom documents were not abstractions, for whom the difference between a legally binding instrument and an imitation of one was a practical matter she dealt with regularly and knew how to evaluate. The room held its breath. Even Jasper was silent. Even Sonny didn't move from the floor, just lay with his chin on his paws, watching the sheriff, the way dogs watch people they hadn't fully decided about yet. Bet refolded everything and set it back in the tin. A pause. "These are legitimate," she said. "The notary seal is Harrow County. I know this mark. I've seen it on documents going back 15 years. She met his eyes. "Douglas Fenn does not have a claim to this parcel. He never did." The fire settled, a small collapse of cedar in the firebox, a brief brightening. "What do you want to do about it?" she said. Caden looked at the tin, looked at the room, the lamp-lit faces, Jasper using Sonny for a pillow. Wynne standing at the edge of the sleeping area with her arms folded, watching him with the full and steady attention that was her particular way of being present. He looked at the stove, which he'd been maintaining for 8 days and would maintain for however many days remained before the storm broke. He'd had time to think about this. 8 days is enough time to think through almost anything, if you're willing to sit with it, honestly. "I need to tell you something else first," he said. He reached into his coat, into the inside pocket against his skin, where it had been since the day he'd found it warm from his body heat, dry intact. He put his mother's notebook on the shelf beside the tin. Bet looked at it. "My mother wrote that," Caden said, "before she died." She reached for it, then stopped. "May I?" He nodded. She opened it and began reading. Wynne crossed the chamber and came to stand beside Caden, not touching him, just beside him, close enough that he could feel the presence of her, the steadiness of it. Her eyes were on his face, not on the sheriff. He didn't look at her, but he felt it. The way someone standing beside you, not in front, not behind, just exactly beside, could change the weight of a room without speaking. Outside, the storm continued. It had been continuing for 8 days and would continue for 2 more. It did not know or care about notebooks or tin boxes or limestone capstones or a boy standing in an underground room trying to figure out what kind of person he was going to be. The storm was honest that way, the same honesty it always was. But it had put him here, in this room, with these people, with this knowledge. And that was going to matter. What he did with it, that was going to matter most of all. Bet stayed in the shelter for those remaining 2 days. She brought her horses around the hill to the leeward side, where Caden had noticed on the second day of his stay a natural depression in the rock that blocked the worst of the wind. She secured them there with the proficiency of a woman who had handled horses in bad conditions before and didn't require assistance or instruction. Inside the shelter, she was quiet. She observed more than she spoke, which was a quality Caden had learned to respect in people, the willingness to take in information before producing conclusions. She watched how he managed the stove, how he checked the ventilation, how he handled the rationing. She helped where help was needed without being asked. She took a shift checking the drainage trench at 3 in the morning on the 9th night, when Caden was finally too tired to stay awake, just appeared beside him and said, "Go sleep," and he did because he trusted the judgment of a woman who had ridden up a mountain in a blizzard to verify that people were alive. On the evening of the 9th day, when the wind had already begun losing some of its force, she sat beside him near the stove while most of the others slept. "The notebook," she said quietly, not as a question. He waited. "I'm going to need to take that with me when we go out." She looked at him steadily. "You understand why." He did. "And the tin stays in the cache," he said, "where it's been." She considered that, then nodded once. "That's sensible," she said. They sat with the fire for a while. "Douglas Fenn," she said eventually, "has a lawyer he's used for 15 years, man from Casper, good at what he does." She paused. "I want you to understand what you're walking into." "I understand it," Caden said. She looked at him. "I understand it," he said again. "My grandfather was a careful man. He was careful because he understood exactly what Douglas Fenn was." He held her gaze. "He left what I needed. I just had to find it." Bet was quiet for a moment. "Your grandfather," she said. "What was he like?" Caden thought about how to answer that in a way that was accurate, rather than just complete. "He was the kind of man," he said finally, "who built a room full of food under a hill and carved 'Built to Share' on the door and never told anyone it existed, because he trusted that the right person would find it when it was needed." Bet looked at the fire. "That kind of trust," she said quietly, "takes a specific kind of faith." "Yes," Caden said, "it does." Part 3. What Caden did with the truth. The storm quit on a Tuesday, no ceremony to it. The wind simply stopped pressing so hard against the hill one morning, and by afternoon the snow was falling straight down instead of sideways, and by evening the silence outside had changed quality, less like breath being held, more like something that had run its course and was finished. Caden had been underground long enough that the change in air pressure woke him before dawn. He lay still, listening to the difference in it for a moment. Then he got up. Sonny was already sitting at the base of the stairs, nose working, ears forward. The posture of a dog who had registered a shift in the world outside and was waiting to see what followed. Caden pulled on his coat and boots, fully dry now, stiff with use but intact, and climbed the stairs. Put his shoulder to the heavy timber door and pushed. It opened. Cold hit him. January cold, serious and unambiguous, but without the violence that had given it teeth for 10 days. When he stepped out onto the stone ledge and looked up, he could see sky. Gray and wrung out, the sky of a weather system that had exhausted itself, but sky. Below him, the valley was white, completely, absolutely unbroken white. The kind of white that made distances unreliable, fence lines, buried creek beds, invisible, the road to Dunwell Creek, somewhere under 4 or 5 feet of settled snow. The pines along the ridge stood dark and waited. Several had lost branches. One had split at the trunk, its root system pulled partly from the frozen ground in a slow collapse that must have happened silently in the night. Greystone Ridge looked like it had been through something, because it had. Sonny pushed past him onto the ledge, lifted his nose, took one long, slow pull of cold air, and then sat down and looked at the valley with the particular uncomplicated presence that dogs sometimes brought to large things, not judging, not narrating, just seeing it. Caden stood beside him for a moment, then went inside to tell the others. Getting 8 people and 2 horses out of a hillside in the aftermath of a major blizzard was, as Jasper observed with the editorial authority of a 10-year-old who had appointed himself the shelter's primary commentator, a lot of waiting around. He wasn't wrong. The snow above the entrance tunnel had drifted 4 feet deep across the lower section of the approach slope. Before anyone could move freely, Caden and Aldous Cork spent 2 hours working with the iron rod, Aldis's flat-bladed camp tool, and their hands clearing a path wide enough for children and horses to pass without sinking to the armpit. Betty worked beside them. She arrived on the slope without announcing her intention. Coat button sleeves pushed up despite the cold, and started moving snow with the methodical efficiency of someone who had done cold weather physical labor before and had no interest in being recognized for it. She placed each shovelful to the side rather than forward the difference between moving snow and moving it somewhere it would need moving again. She read the slope the way his grandfather had read problems, figuring out the logic before committing the effort. Caden noticed. He said nothing. He just moved snow. Wynne managed the children's exit with the calm authority of someone who understood that children needed clear instructions, delivered without any hint of anxiety. She held the Greer 4-year-old on her hip. The boy had attached himself to her somewhere around day 3 and had not meaningfully detached since, and walked the older Greer children through the cleared path with the firm, unhurried guidance that children responded to instinctively. Because children were remarkably good at detecting the difference between performed calm and actual calm. Wynne was actually calm. She had handled worse than this, and her body knew it, and the children's bodies knew she knew it, and so they followed her without fuss. Bet took the horses last. She narrated the path to them in a low, continuous voice as she led them down the slope. Not to calm them, they were reasonably composed, but because she appeared to believe that animals deserved to be informed about what was happening to them. She described the footing, the turning points, the places where the snow was firmer, and the places where it was liable to give. Jasper watched this from a position of relative safety and said, "Is she talking to the horses?" "Yes," Caden said. "Do they understand her?" "They understand that she's paying attention to them." Jasper received this with the particular gravity of a 10-year-old encountering an idea that was going to require some time to fully process. "That's actually kind of smart," he said. "Yes," Caden said. The valley was worse than it had looked from the ridge. He hadn't seen much of Dunwell Creek since October, since the last supply run before the snows locked in. But he knew the landscape well enough that the absences were immediately visible. The Greer storage shed, which had stood at the corner of their south field for as long as Caden could remember, was now a dark, collapsed shape, the roof driven down by accumulated snow weight until the walls had failed outward and the whole structure folded in on itself. 3 other storage buildings on the main road had gone the same way. The Aldous Cork trapping post had lost its chimney pipe, entirely ripped from the base by wind. The resulting hole open to weather for 10 straight days. Whatever the wind could reach inside it had reached. Most families who'd stayed in their cabins had survived, but the cold penetration over 10 days had been severe. Green wood had smoked without burning properly. Frozen wells forced people to melt snow for water-burning fuel they couldn't easily replace. Wall gaps and door seams that had been merely drafty in normal winters had become genuine dangers. 3 families had abandoned their homes mid-storm and made their way to neighbors. 2 of those abandoned homes had burst pipes when they froze solid. Nobody had died. That was the sentence people kept repeating to each other in the first days after the storm, carefully, deliberately, as if it required regular confirmation to stay true. Nobody died, and when they said it, they looked often toward the ridge, toward the pale limestone visible above the tree line, toward the place where on the worst nights a thin thread of smoke had been visible, rising from the hillside and dissolving into the blizzard above it. Some had seen it and not believed it. Some had believed it but couldn't reach it. All of them heard the account afterward in the slow, disjointed way news traveled through a small settlement after a storm carried by Aldous Cork, to the feed store by May Greer, to the church on Sunday by Jasper, to every person he encountered in the week following, because Jasper was constitutionally incapable of not telling people about the underground room and the dog and the boy and the beans. Especially the beans. He mentioned the beans with remarkable consistency. Bet Calloway rode to the county seat 4 days after the storm broke, alone. The road was barely passable, drifts cut through in some places and piled chest-high in others, the whole journey a series of negotiations between horse and terrain. She told no one she was going except Wynne Holt, and she told Wynne only because Wynne asked her directly, and Betty had apparently concluded early in their acquaintance that lying to Winifred Holt was an expenditure that cost more than whatever it saved. The notary in Harrow, Wynne said. Not a question. And the county recorder, possibly the circuit judge if he's still in the territory. How long? Depends on conditions. Wynn looked at her. A week, Bet said. Maybe a few days over. And Douglas Fenn? Bet pulled on her gloves, one finger at a time with the patient thoroughness she brought to small tasks. Douglas Fenn signed the transfer documents on the eastern parcel, she said carefully. Those transfers were legally executed under your mother's authority as property holder. They're complicated to undo. She paused. But the western parcel was never his to transfer. Any arrangement he made regarding it is void from the origin point. That's not my opinion. That's property law. And the other matter, Wynn said, Clara Merritt. A pause longer than the others. That's more complicated legally, Bet said. What I have is a notebook, one side of a private correspondence. No replies, no third-party witness to the conversations described. She looked at Wynn steadily. Legally. But a doctor made 2 recorded visits with documented instructions about heating requirements that were demonstrably not followed. And there are people in this town who knew that bedroom flue was broken and knew Douglas Fenn was told to fix it. She settled her hat, a small adjustment, precise. Those people have opinions. They do, Wynn said. Opinions that might become statements, with the right person doing the asking. With the right person, Wynn agreed. Betty mounted her horse. Keep that boy where I can find him, she said. Wynn watched her ride south through the path between drifts. Then she went to find Caden. He was at the shelter the way she found him there every morning that week working. That particular morning he was replacing the iron bolts on the door's exterior, the cold having contracted the metal enough that one bolt was catching in its bracket. He worked it back and forth with steady pressure, persuading it rather than forcing it, because forcing iron in cold weather was how you ended up with a strip bracket. Wynn stood at the top of the cleared path and watched him for a moment without announcing herself. 16 years old. She kept coming back to that. Not with pity. She'd learned in her 40s that pity was an expensive emotion that helped no one and cost the person feeling it more than they generally anticipated. Something else. The word that came closest was recognition. The particular recognition of someone who had spent enough of her life watching people under pressure to know what it looked like when a person chose without drama, without announcement, to become adequate to what they were facing. She'd known a handful of people like that in 66 years. They weren't always who you'd have predicted. Not the biggest or the loudest or the most officially credentialed. Sometimes they were field nurses nobody had heard of. Sometimes they were old men who built rooms under hills and wrote careful letters to grandchildren they trusted to find them. Sometimes they were 16-year-old boys with a golden dog and a tin box and a dead mother's notebook pressed against their skin. She walked down the path. Sonny lifted his chin from the snow where he'd been resting, watching Caden work, with the particular focused devotion of a dog who had made a decision about his person and wasn't in the habit of revisiting decisions. Betty's gone to the county seat, Wynn said. Caden kept working the bolt. I know. She'll be a week. I know that too. He worked the bolt twice through its full range. Satisfied, he stood back and looked at the door, at the carved initials on the outside face, RM, and below them in cuts he'd made himself after the legal situation became clear enough. CM 1893. The wood needs sealing before the thaw, he said. The lower section is starting to show weathering. Wynn looked at the door, at the initials, at the words below Rubens carved with the same knife by younger hands that had learned to read wood from an old man who hadn't lived long enough to explain why everything he'd built was going to matter. What are you going to do? She said. After. He was quiet for a moment. The quiet of someone who had the answer and was making sure he had the right version of it before saying it out loud. I'm not taking the farm, he said. I know. The eastern parcel, I understand that's legally complicated. And I don't... He stopped, started again. I don't want to stand in a house where Douglas Fenn has rearranged everything and call it mine. No. I want the western parcel. I want this shelter. He looked at the door. At the hillside above it, heavy with snow, but solid permanent there before he was born. And I want it open. Wynn waited. Every winter, he said, for whoever needs it. Not mine to keep, mine to maintain. Those are different things. Wynn was quiet for a long moment. Yes, she said finally. They are. She didn't add anything to that, because it didn't need anything added. The hearing was held in the second week of February. Not a trial, technically. The circuit judge, a man named Aldous Pruitt, who had been making territory rounds for 20 years and carried the specific, unhurried authority of someone who had heard every conceivable human dispute and remained equable through all of them, held what he called a formal examination. The procedural difference from a trial meant fewer things went into official record and more things could be said plainly. Pruitt had run these examinations for 2 decades. He understood their particular utility. The hearing was in the back room of the Dunwell Creek General Store, the largest enclosed space in the settlement. Someone had brought extra chairs. By the time Pruitt called the examination to order, the chairs were all taken, and people stood along every wall. They came because they wanted to be in the room, because a small settlement in the aftermath of a hard winter had no abstractions. Everything that happened touched everyone, and everyone understood that what was decided here would define what the community was and who it protected. Douglas Fenn sat near the judge's table. His coat was brushed. His expression composed the expression of a man who had walked into many rooms like this one and knew how to present himself in them. Assured, prepared, certain that rooms generally resolved in his favor. He looked once across the room to where Caden sat. Caden looked back. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say yet. What Caden noticed in that brief exchange of looks was something he hadn't expected to see in Douglas Fenn's face. Not confidence, not arrogance. Something underneath those things, something older, the expression of a man carrying something heavy and having carried it long enough that he'd almost forgotten it was there. Almost. He'd think about that later. Judge Pruitt arranged his papers with the deliberation of a man who had learned that rushing the beginning of proceedings made everything that followed worse. "We're here," he said without preamble, "to establish a clear accounting of property rights on Greystone Ridge and the question of the western parcel. Sheriff Calloway has submitted documentation. I've reviewed it." He set the papers down and looked at the room over his spectacles. "I have questions. Then others will have the opportunity to speak." He questioned Bet first. She answered cleanly. The documents the notary sealed the chain of ownership as recorded at county level compared to what Douglas Fenn had represented when he'd first approached her office. She gave it without performance or editorializing. Just facts placed in sequence allowed to mean what they meant. Douglas Fenn's attorney, a man who had ridden from Casper specifically for this occasion, which communicated something about how Douglas had assessed the situation, asked several questions. Bet answered those too in the same even register. Then Pruitt asked Caden to stand. The room went quiet in a specific way, not the polite quiet of people observing a proceeding, the quiet of people who had made a decision to pay attention. "You found these documents," Pruitt said. "Yes, sir. In a shelter on the western parcel." "In a shelter my grandfather built." "On the western parcel, yes." "You had no prior knowledge of this shelter's existence." "No, sir." "How did you find it?" Caden paused. Because here was the thing about answering that question honestly in this room in front of these people. It required saying that a dog had led him to it. A golden retriever in a blizzard. A dog who had refused to follow the road south, who had pulled west for 3 miles against the rope, who had then dug into packed snow beside a limestone slope until a 16-year-old with numb hands had uncovered his grandfather's door. He could see Douglas Fenn's attorney already preparing an expression, the kind that communicated to a judge that a boy claiming to have found legal documents by following a dog was perhaps not the most reliable narrator the court might encounter. Caden said it anyway. "My dog found the entrance," he said. "Sonny. He kept pulling west when I was trying to reach the main road south. I followed him. He dug at a section of packed snow near the limestone slope on the western ridge. The door was underneath. A sound moved through the room. Not laughter, not mockery. Something warmer and harder to name." Judge Pruitt looked at Caden over his spectacles for a moment. "Your dog," he said. "Yes, sir." "A golden retriever." "Yes, sir." Pruitt looked down at his papers, made a sound in his throat that was impossible to interpret. "Then continue." Winholt stood up next. Nobody had called her. She simply stood, and the room's attention moved to her without being redirected, because there was a quality to Winholt standing up that made attention move to her without being asked. She was 66 years old. She had survived 3 decades of frontier winters, a typhoid epidemic, the loss of her husband in 1879, and 10 days in an underground shelter in the worst blizzard in living memory. She was standing in this room because she had decided to stand, not because anyone had summoned her. She told the judge what she had seen. The organized food stores, the maintained ventilation, the drainage trench that Caden cleared at midnight on the fourth day when it started compacting inward, the sleeping area arranged specifically to manage body heat distribution, the way the rationing was handled evenly, without exception, without calculation of who deserved more or less. She described Caden giving his portion to Jasper on the third night because Jasper was 10 years old and growing and had used more energy in the cold than his small frame could easily replace. She said all of this in the same flat, precise, witnessed-it-myself tone she used for everything. Then she said, "I've been in this territory 30 years. I've seen men twice this boy's size and age come apart in situations that required less. I've watched grown adults, when resources are limited, make decisions about who matters and who doesn't." She paused. This boy made no such decisions. What there was, he shared. What needed doing, he did. What required thought, he thought through. Another pause. "I am not a woman who overstates things. I am stating exactly what I observed." She sat down. Jasper beside her said nothing, which was, under the circumstances, remarkable. Aldous Cork. Barely 10 words because Aldous was constitutionally economical. But those 10 words included fair share every night, no exceptions. 3 words that went into the room and didn't come back out. Walter Greer, who had hidden biscuits for his children on the second day and who stood now and said nothing about the biscuits, but whose voice, when he described watching Caden work the ventilation shaft at midnight on the 7th night, carried a quality that nobody in the room could categorize precisely, but everyone could recognize. May Greer, who had come through the door carrying a 4-year-old on her hip with nothing left in her, who said only, "He took my boy from my arms before I'd asked him to," like he already knew. Then Jasper stood up. Prewitt hadn't called him. He simply stood. Wynn put her hand on his arm. He looked at her. She looked at him. She let go. He was 10 years old, standing with his hands in his coat pockets and his chin up, and he spoke with the specific gravity that children produced when they understood that something important was happening and they had something true to contribute to it. "On the second night, I was really hungry and he gave me part of his dinner. He said he wasn't very hungry." Jasper paused. "But I could tell he was. I could tell because he looked at the bowl first, before he gave it to me." Another pause. "I just thought someone should say that." He sat back down. The room was quiet. Douglas Fenn's attorney was writing something, deliberately head down, pen moving. Douglas Fenn was not writing anything. He was looking at the floor. And the expression on his face, Caden caught it from across the room in the moment before Douglas rearranged it into something more controlled, was not what Caden had expected. Not anger, not calculation. Something older than both of those. The look of a man who was recognizing something and who found recognition at this particular moment more difficult than he'd anticipated. Prewitt asked Caden to stand again at the end. The February light through the store windows had gone flat and gray, the short afternoon retreating. Someone had lit the ceiling lanterns. The room had been going for over 2 hours and had the specific stillness of a space where people had been paying close attention for a long time and hadn't stopped. "You understand," Prewitt said, "that the documentation supports your claim to the western parcel." "Yes, sir." "The eastern parcel and the main farm." He paused, choosing words with care. "Those transfers, while involving a man who has not conducted himself with full integrity in this matter, were legally executed under your mother's authority as property holder. Challenging them would require a different and more extended proceeding." Caden nodded. Betta had explained this. "What do you want?" Prewitt said. The question had been following him for weeks. He looked at the room. At every face turned toward him, people he'd fed and kept warm and organized, and watched sleep people he'd sat beside in firelight eating navy beans out of tin cups. May Greer with the 4-year-old on her lap, now the child half asleep, one small hand twisted into the fabric of her coat. He looked at Wynn. She was looking back at him with the full, steady attention that was her particular way of being present. "Whatever you say, I will hear it." He looked at Sonny sitting at his feet. He hadn't noticed the dog move there. Just there, solid and warm and present the way the dog had been present from the moment Caden stepped off his own porch into the cold. He looked at Douglas Fenn. Douglas was looking at him now directly, not at the floor. That guarded, careful expression. The man behind it had always been difficult to read. Maybe that was the nature of men like Douglas, legible only in the moments they forgot to perform composure. In the moment when Jasper stood up. In the moment when May Greer said he took my boy before I'd asked him to. In those moments, Douglas had shown something. Caden didn't know precisely what it was, didn't feel a need to name it. That was Douglas's business to figure out, not his. He looked back at this judge. The western parcel, he said, and the shelter. That's what's mine, and that's what I'm asking for. Prewitt nodded slowly. The eastern parcel, the farm. Caden was quiet for a moment. He could fight for the farm. Bet thought there was a case to be built if he wanted to spend the years building it. If he wanted to anchor himself to a property that smelled like Douglas Fenn's rearrangements, and his mother's frightened notebook entries, and a bedroom with a broken flue and a thermometer that had read 41 degrees. He could have it. He didn't want it. Sean, I want one thing from the farm, he said. The chair by the hearth. It was my father's. It has a cracked armrest that nobody ever fixed. I want that chair. The room held very still. That's all, Prewitt said. And I want to use the proceeds from the cattle Douglas sold, since those cattle were sold before the legal questions about the property were raised, to help repair what the storm damaged for the families here who can't afford to repair it themselves. He said it without looking at Douglas. Those families lost what they lost trying to survive the same storm. It seems like a reasonable use. He felt it more than heard it, the change that moved through the room. Not a sound exactly. A collective shift in weight. A breath that several people took at approximately the same time. Douglas Fenn's attorney said something under his breath to Douglas. Douglas looked at him. Then Douglas looked at Caden and said directly to him, without consulting anyone, without looking anywhere else, "Your father would have done the same thing." 7 quiet words. Not an apology, not a justification, not a negotiating position, a thing that Douglas Fenn needed to say, and had perhaps needed to say for longer than the last few weeks. A thing that once said could not be taken back, which Douglas appeared to understand and had said anyway. Caden looked at him. He held the look for a moment. Then he nodded one small honest and looked back at the judge. Because there was nothing to say in response. Whatever Douglas was recognizing, whatever he was working through, that was Douglas's to carry. Caden didn't need to do anything with it except hear it. He'd heard it. The chair arrived at the shelter in early March. Aldous brought it in his wagon when the road finally allowed a careful driver to make the ridge. Between Aldous and Caden and Jasper, who watched for approximately 30 seconds before deciding that watching was intolerable, when participation was available, they carried the chair down the cleared path and into the shelter entrance. Caden set it just inside the door where the passage light came in from above. Not the most practical location, but he didn't put it there for practical reasons. He put it there because it was his father's chair, and because this was his grandfather's shelter, and because it was his, now his, and eventually everyone's. Jasper sat in it immediately. "The armrest is cracked," he said. "I know. You should fix it." "I shouldn't." Jasper considered him with his customary 10-year-old gravity. "Some things," Caden said, "are supposed to stay the way they are." "That's either very wise or very lazy," Jasper said. "Probably both," Caden said. Wynn appeared at the entrance with a cloth-wrapped bundle food, the way she brought food most mornings now when she came to check on the shelter. Not because he needed feeding, because checking on the shelter took time, and she'd been 66 years old long enough to know that hunger was an unnecessary inconvenience when it could be avoided. She looked at the chair for a moment, at the cracked armrest, at where Caden had positioned it in the entrance passage where the light fell on it in the mornings. "Your father's," she said. "Yes." She set the bundle on the entrance shelf and walked past the chair to check the ventilation shaft, which she had developed strong opinions about during 10 days underground, and continued to have opinions about at regular intervals. "Draw looks good," she reported from inside. "Widen the intake another inch last week. Cedar's getting low. I know. I'll cut more before the end of the month. I can ask Aldous to—" "I'll cut it," Caden said. Quiet. Clear. The way you said things that were yours to do. Wynn appeared back at the entrance. Looked at him. "Yes," she said. "You will." Spring came to Greystone Ridge, the way spring came to high country, slowly, skeptically, with frequent reversals. A warm day would pull the snow back 2 feet from the tree line, and a cold night would add an inch back, and the melt would run in thin silver lines down the limestone face all morning before freezing again at dusk. The ridge ran its own weather system separate from the valley below, operating on its own schedule. The valley recovered. Gradually and imperfectly, the way communities recovered from hard winters, by doing the work one task at a time without the comfort of a definitive ending. Fences rebuilt, walls reshingled, root cellars redesigned. That last item was different this year. After what had happened on the ridge, after what people now understood about why some things had survived and some things hadn't, redesigning storage wasn't a restoration project, it was a rethinking. People dug deeper. They came to Caden to ask about it, not with ceremony, just practically. Walter Greer came first and asked about the limestone block system for keeping barrels off the dirt floor. Caden showed him. May Greer came and asked about ventilation shaft positioning because she wanted to think about airflow from the beginning rather than discover its importance after something went wrong. The school teacher came two families from the north end, a rancher from the east slope who had lost a significant amount of winter feed to dampness and had no interest in a repeat. Caden wasn't a teacher. He answered questions and demonstrated things and told people when he didn't know something and where they might find out. He also directed people to the journal. He had Reuben's journal copied, Bet helped him find a transcription clerk in the county seat, and the copy went to the settlement's small lending collection. The original went back into the tin, into the cache, under the limestone capstone, where it had always been, where it would stay. On a Sunday near the end of March, Wynn came to the shelter with Jasper and brought no food. Caden noticed the absence immediately and said nothing about it. They walked up the slope together, Sunny ahead of them navigating the remaining snow patches with the cheerful efficiency of a dog who considered snow an interesting terrain feature rather than an obstacle. The valley was visible from the ridge entrance in a way it hadn't been all winter. The snow pulled back far enough to see the road, the creek line, the dark shapes of the settlement's buildings, smoke from chimneys, the small, distant movement of people going about the ordinary business of their ordinary days. Ordinary. He kept coming back to that word, what it meant, how it felt in its absence. Ordinary was what got taken first, he'd learned when things went wrong. Not dramatically, not all at once, but incrementally, the way winter took from a poorly built cabin, through the gaps, along the seams, 1 degree at a time, and ordinary was what came back the same way. "What are you thinking?" Wynn said beside him. He considered the question honestly. "About my grandfather," he said. "About whether he knew, when he carved built to share on that door, whether he knew it would end up being this, a community thing." "What do you think?" Caden looked at the shelter entrance behind them, at the thin thread of smoke still rising from the vent hole, controlled and steady. "I think he knew exactly," he said. "He wasn't building a hiding place. He was building a promise. He just didn't know who he was making it to yet." Wynn was quiet for a while. "He sounds like he was worth knowing," she said. "He was." A pause. "You take after him," she said. He looked at her. She looked back, the same steady, present attention she brought to everything. Not flattering him, not softening a difficult thing, stating what she had observed and was willing to stand behind. He looked back at the valley. Jasper had wandered along the ridge somewhere and was audible nearby, narrating something to himself or to Sunny or to the ridge in general. It was hard to tell and probably didn't matter. The boy maintained a running commentary on his own experience that seemed to help him process it. Caden thought about his mother's handwriting. December 28th. I am frightened for Caden. Not for myself, for him. She had been right to be frightened, and she had been wrong in the most important ways. She'd imagined him alone. She couldn't have imagined in the cold, frightened December, where she wrote those words, what January would actually bring. A dog who knew the way before he did. A hill that kept what it covered. An old woman who took a child off a stranger's hip without being asked and went looking for what needed doing. People who knocked on an underground door in a blizzard and were let in. He reached into his coat pocket. The brass thimble was there, smooth, small, warm from his body heat. His mother's and her mother's before that. He turned it once between his fingers, felt the weight of it, put it back. Sunny appeared at his side without announcement and pressed against his leg with that solid, unhurried warmth that had been there from the moment Caden stepped off his porch into the storm. Always there, always steady. Caden put his hand on the dog's back. Below, the valley went about the business of recovery, smoke and movement, and the sounds of a community that had been tested and had come through. Not without cost, not perfectly, but through. He thought about what his grandfather had written in the last clear section of the journal before the entries about Douglas Fenn, in the land and the careful preparations of a man who understood what he was preparing against. The earth keeps what it covers better than men do. He'd sat with that sentence in the firelight for 10 days underground. He'd been sitting with it ever since. And what he'd come to understand in the slow, certain way he was learning to understand things was that the sentence worked in two directions. The first, the earth was a better container than anything men built on its surface. He'd seen that proven thoroughly. The second, quieter, the earth also kept what you put into it. The work, the care, the preparation built not for yourself, but for whoever came after, whoever followed a dog in a blizzard, whoever needed a door to be already there when they arrived. His grandfather had put something into this hill. It was still there, still holding, still keeping. Caden stood on the ridge in the thin March sunlight, with Sunny warm against his leg and wind steady at his shoulder, and Jasper's voice somewhere along the ridge, narrating the ongoing story of being 10 years old in Wyoming at the end of a long winter. He put his hand flat against the limestone face of the ridge beside him, felt the faint warmth in it, the warmth that stone absorbed slowly over time and held long after the source of heat was gone. His grandfather's fire's in there somewhere from 14 years of careful winters. His grandfather's hands. He was going to stay here. He was going to work. He was going to keep the cedar stocked and the ventilation clean and the drainage clear and the door properly sealed. He was going to keep the fire ready and the food stores rotated and the path to the entrance passable. And when the storms came, because they always came in high country, always came again, he was going to open the door. That was the thing Reuben had carved into the wood for whoever would eventually stand on the inside and read it. Built to last, built to share. His grandfather had known that the person who found this place would be someone who needed it, and that a person who needed something that badly and found it anyway, that person would understand the obligation that came with the finding. Would understand that built to share was not a suggestion. It was the whole point. The shelter without the sharing was just a hiding place. The sharing was what made it mean something. Caden had understood that the moment he opened the door to Win and Jasper, though he wouldn't have been able to say it that way until now. And Sunny's tail was moving slow and even the way it moved when everything was right, when the work was done for the day, and the direction home was clear, and the person at the other end of whatever connection existed between them was exactly where he was supposed to be. Like something that had always known the way. Like something that had simply been waiting for him to stop arguing with the rope and follow.